heaps to talk about as far as the economy is going. So yes, survive to 25 has become survive 25, I think it's fair to say, particularly for those in construction, retail and hospitality, which is a fairly large chunk of the economy, I suppose, but also when you think about it, sectors that have bigger booms and busts than other parts of the economy, really. Very sensitive to interest rates, very sensitive to how households are feeling, and it all sort of connects in on itself, I suppose. When the housing market's not going well, it's just harder yards for retail and hospo, and that is certainly the case at the moment. So I think to understand where we are now, it's useful to just look at where we've been, which has been a pretty crazy few years. COVID hit, and we as economists had a bit of an attack of groupthink, and I'm not exempting myself from that accusation. The assumption was that this would be a huge negative shock to confidence and people's willingness to spend, but we all underestimated the impact of the wage subsidy, which was hugely expensive, but also hugely effective. Once people realised the money was going to keep landing in their accounts and businesses realised the same thing, everyone kept spending, and they couldn't go on holiday, they couldn't go out, they couldn't go to a restaurant, so they all bought stuff instead and wanted it delivered to the door. So there was a massive substitution from services to goods at the same time, that actually there wasn't this hole in demand that was expected. At the same time, the supply disruptions from lockdowns, from border closures, from shipping disruptions and ports seizing up and ship containers being stranded in the wrong place, pandemonium in supply chains. So you put that together, far too much demand-side stimulus from monetary and fiscal policy at a time when the world's ability to meet that demand was very crimped. Inflation everywhere. That we should have seen it coming, I guess, with hindsight. But yeah, it shot over 7%, which was very painful, and that of course caused the Reserve Bank to admit that they were deliberately going to cause a recession. So that's a first. I've never heard a central bank admit that before. Not great for their social license, but it did hasten the process, I suppose, because business confidence tanked. But it's not as if we didn't have inflation targeting, we wouldn't have had a bust, because that boom was unsustainable. House prices went up 50% in 2 years. We had the biggest housing bubble, and I'm going to call it a bubble, in the world, in our history. We all went on a spending binge and blew out our trade balance, our current account, and our fiscal balance. And so I remember a farmer saying to me during COVID, look, haven't we just proven we don't need those bloody tourists? Look, GDP's booming with the border closed. And I went, yeah, and have you seen our current account deficit? The fact is, to buy stuff from the world, you have to sell stuff to the world. And that can be exports or it can be your land. I mean, pick your poison, but one way or another, you've got to square the books. And so that was never going to be sustainable. And in the end, the Reserve Bank precipitated it. But I think most firms would know that what we saw during the COVID period wasn't normal. It wasn't the new normal. And actually, we saw that businesses were very cautious about borrowing through that period. Despite many making money hand over fist, they were cautious about expanding. I think people knew this wasn't going to last. But of course, we did go into recession in the middle of last year, a deep recession. The economy shrank more than 1% in each of the middle quarters of last year. So that's a big hole. So you'd think that now we're in third quarter of the next year, the year-on-year comparisons will be looking pretty good because we're comparing with an economy in a whole. But no, actually, it's been quite a stop-start recovery. So the Reserve Bank started easing rates in about August last year, and they've eased a lot from 5.5 down to 3.25. But it's taking time to feed through for sure. And actually, things have slid backwards in the last few months. January, February, March were quite good, and then April, May, June were quite dire. And July, the jury's out, but yeah, probably a bit iffy as well for many sectors. So, and that was pretty widespread. It was construction, retail, hospitality, even services, all telling us that in a year-on-year comparison, things were weaker in Q2 than they were in Q1, which is quite something when you consider what you're comparing against, which was a big hole, as I mentioned. So clearly the level of activity is nothing flash at the moment. So, but why did we go into a slide? Well, part of it could be slightly dodgy data, to be fair. Insofar as, you know, if you look at a chart of GDP or anything, really, it looks like it had a cardiac arrest during COVID. We had the lockdowns and rebounds and lockdowns and rebounds, and the volatility was really extreme. And then you ask your data program to seasonally adjust that, and it goes, So it does appear that at the moment there's a little bit of residual seasonality in the data, that the Q1 data looks better and the Q2 data looks worse. So it may be revised. Years from now it might not look so bad, but the fact is it feels pretty bad here and now. And actually we were just talking earlier about how maybe seasonality has changed with in some industries as well. We've got weather changes in agriculture, that's be a pretty big factor. We've got the loss of tourism and the rebound of tourism, the slowdown in business spending, all these sorts of things can make the data messy. So you have to always take it with a bit of a grain of salt. But there's a lot of data suggesting that April, May, June, maybe into July was softer. So why would that be? Well, of course, we had Trump's Liberation Day on the 4th of April, which freaked everybody out. He backed off and things calmed down, but it was quite scary. And of course, there's been enormous uncertainty since then, and so for our exporters, that's a slightly alarming environment. But I think even beyond just our exporters, there's awareness that New Zealand's fate tends to be very correlated with how the rest of the world is going, and so that sort of has had this dark cloud hanging over us. So we saw investment intentions and employment intentions drop a lot more than firms' activity expectations. So that suggests that an uncertainty effect was happening there. So the big driver of investment decisions is always the domestic economic outlook, whether you're investing or not investing. That's always the number one reason firms give in our survey. But what we did see was that firms who say they're going to invest less, the global economic environment jumped up to be number two. So that's obviously having an impact, I think. And it will be impacting employment decisions as well. Hiring someone's a pretty risky decision too. You have to be relatively confident about what's coming to do that. On the other hand, amongst firms who say they are going to invest, we saw central government policy jump to number two. So that's the investment boost, presumably, that was announced in the budget. And a cynic might say it's just going to be a timing effect, that it might bring forward some investment that was going to happen anyway. But and the jury's out on how big it's going to be. I'm sceptical about the impact on productivity because it includes utes and commercial property and earthquake strengthening, none of which are really going to boost productivity. But it at least is probably quite a well-timed stimulus for investment in terms of offsetting this chill wind that seems to be blowing from offshore. But if that is what is cooling the economy and maybe these seasonal impacts, then things should improve. There's no reason to think the economy is just going to fall flat on its face and fail to get up. We've got interest rates are lower, and every week more people are rolling over onto lower mortgage rates. People are also really struggling with the cost of living, though, and that I think is acting like a tax in terms of people's discretionary spending. But we've also got very strong rural incomes with dairy prices and meat prices doing really, really well. So that's the counter to it. It's a hard sell to say that higher food prices are good. But the fact is New Zealand's one of very, very few countries in the world for whom that is true in aggregate. But of course, like any price movements create winners and losers, and the winners are the farmers and the losers are the people at the supermarket. So I think, food price inflation's running at about 4.5%. Consumers' inflation expectations are running at 5.1. The actual inflation rate is literally half that. But of course, the actual inflation rate includes stuff that costs a lot but you don't buy very often, like computers and furniture and stuff like that. But in terms of your daily spend, I think inflation is running a lot higher than 2.7%, and in particular the food. And of course, that daily spend is a much bigger chunk of spend for lower income households as well, who just spend more money on food anyway and are particularly hard hit by this. So we've seen in our consumer confidence survey that confidence is very low. It's recovered somewhat. There's a massive negative correlation with inflation. People hate inflation. Even when their wages are increasing enough to actually compensate them for it, they just hate it, which is why we have inflation targeting, I suppose. But it is recovering, but it's still about the levels it was in 2008 when we were in a horrible recession and unemployment was way higher than it is now. But I think, if firms are saying they're going to give pay increases of about 2.5%, and households are thinking inflation's going to be more than 5%, then households think they're going backwards to the tune of 2.5% a year. So we're not forecasting actual real wage outcomes to be anything like that bad, but perceptions matter. And when we look at our card spending data, we can slice and dice it however we like and look at quite detailed information. So we can see that apparel is it's about 10% lower in nominal terms than it was at the start of 2023. And it's been going nowhere. Our hospitality, within hospitality, we can see that junk food is outdoing cafes and restaurants. And even within junk food, the non-branded stuff is doing better than the branded. So people are trading down from McDonald's to fish and chips or whatever. So there's evidence of trading down all over our survey. Discretionary Christmas present stuff is really struggling. So sports stores, art galleries, camera shops, all those sorts of things, bicycle shops, really going south. So essentially there's a bifurcation between the must-haves and the nice-to-haves in terms of people's spending, and it's hard to see that turning around anytime soon, and particularly until the housing market gets its mojo back. And there I think the constraint is that it turns out, yes, there were a lot of people waiting to buy a house, but there were even more people waiting to sell a house. So once the Reserve Bank started cutting rates, actually the number of listings and the inventory for sale actually lifted. So heaps of choice in the market. So as long as that's the case and all the power's on the seller's side of the table, you're not going to get prices going up. So prices are like zero year on year, basically. We've all been revising our house price forecast down from 7.5 to 4.5 to 2.5, and the latest data that was out this morning suggests downside risk to that in terms of where the house prices will end the year relative to the end of last year. And I think if you're a first-time buyer, what's the rush? And if you're an investor, you're looking at rising rates. They're rising like 11 or 12% year on year. Insurance, the rate of inflation's coming down, but still increasing. But rents are actually outright falling, new rents. So in Wellington particularly, there's a lot of rental properties sitting empty, which, if you're reliant on cash flow to pay the mortgage on an investment property, that's toxic. So as an investor, you're sitting there and you put the numbers into the spreadsheet and it goes, nah, not unless you're expecting large capital gains. That would be then it's a good opportunity to buy if you've got deep pockets and a long horizon, because the prices are a lot lower than they were. But otherwise, it doesn't really stack up as a cash flow investment. So investors are sitting on the sidelines as well. And as long as that's the case, then the housing market's not going to rip away. And as long as that's the case, then things like car sales and furniture sales and spa pools and whatnot will also continue to struggle, and so too will construction. So at the moment it's cheaper to buy an existing house than to build a new one. So as long as that's the case, then you will build if you want something bespoke, but otherwise, if you don't have a dream of building your dream house, then you might as well just buy that one or that one or that one or that one. There's lots and lots of choice out there. So we've seen consents really, really flat. So actually the construction sector just is on the biggest roller coaster across the whole economy. It gets the biggest booms and the biggest busts. So a few months ago, it was actually in the second half of last year was the bottom. We had net 60% of firms in the construction sector telling us they were less busy than a year ago, which is, and practically everybody really, when you consider there'll be a few who are saying, oh, we're muddling along the same. The upshot is hardly anyone was busier than a year ago. Retail is still sitting about negative net 20%, which is pretty bad. So more firms still finding things going backwards year on year than going forwards. Yeah. Which, as I said, your comparison point is so bad that's not a strong picture. But so the Reserve Bank has eased rates, but they've actually moved more cautiously lately because they've cut quite a bit already, and they think neutral is about 3%. So their model says that we're driving an automatic. You take your foot off the brake and the car will move forward. However, there's also the possibility the economy is a manual and you actually need to put your foot on the accelerator. So, the OCR is still slightly north of neutral, so the foot's still sitting very lightly on the brake or thereabouts. Our view is actually they need to get rates under 3 to get the economy going again. So we're actually forecasting that they will end up cutting to 2.5% from the current 3.25. A cut next week is fully expected, fully priced. You've seen ANZ, BNZ, and I think Kiwibank follow today, cutting mortgage rates in anticipation of that. So the Reserve Bank gave a very clear signal they'd do it. So that's looking like an easy one to forecast, but the next one could be tricky because they've said, right, we're data dependent, we're not going to make any promises, which makes sense, as you get nearer the turning point. You don't want to oversteer. The fact is it takes a very long time for what the Reserve Bank does with interest rates to feed through to the economy. It seems to be taking even longer at the moment, but it's at least a year, if not 18 months, before you really start to see the impact. And I remember on the other side that when Adrian Orr said he was going to cause a recession, business confidence tanked and he started hiking. And then a couple of months later, business confidence bounced right back because everyone went, oh, actually, we're fine. And then a year later, everything fell into a hole. So, it just does take longer than people expect. So that's also playing on the Reserve Bank's mind that, they've done all this easing and things are not looking great, but the real impact of that easing is going to come through in the second half of this year. And if they cut a whole heap more now, then, the economy could take off. And at the end of the day, they don't have a GDP target or an unemployment target. They've got an inflation target. And they're just a little worried about inflation at the moment. I mean, that is their job, to be paranoid about inflation. So I'm not throwing rocks at them for that, unlike some people. But it's a tricky situation because I think there's medium-term downside risks to the economy and therefore to inflation. But in the meantime, here and now, we've got a bit of upside inflation risk. So we've got butter prices up 50% year on year. We've got rates running at 12, 13%. You've got household inflation expectations over 5%. And you've got inflation expectations, not just households, but some other measures looking quite high. So the Reserve Bank is like, oh, could it actually be that inflation is getting away on us again? I understand the concern, but our take is that that concern is misplaced and that over the coming weeks and months, those concerns will dissipate quite a lot. So if you go back to your school stats days, forgive my nerdiness for a minute, but they've got a new business survey that showed that the long-run inflation expectations have risen over the last year from 4% to 5%. So that's just like massive red flag for inflation targeting central banks, that they're losing credibility. But in their last monetary policy statement, they had a little discussion and they admitted that that was a mean, an average, and that it had been dragged up by a few people putting in really large numbers, like 10% or even more. So essentially that's a few people saying, I don't think inflation targeting is going to survive the next decade. And I mean, that's a valid concern to have, particularly for some other countries like the US, which are for reasons I won't go into, but I think, it's a pretty small risk in New Zealand. You wouldn't normally allow those outliers to have a big impact on your reported measure of expectations. So from the next read, which we'll get next week, they're going to start reporting a median, which does cut those outliers out. I think it will look a lot more benign, and everyone can just take a deep breath and go, no, we're good. Because this is not an environment where it's easy to pass your costs through to your prices. Firms are telling us, we can see their expected costs are here and their expected pricing is there, and margins are crushed. And then, then it's a Clayton's choice, isn't it? You raise your prices and lose all your customers, or you don't raise your prices and die more slowly. I mean, that's the extreme, and we are seeing more business failures as a result of that. But if they could, of course, firms would raise their prices more. They need to, but consumers are extremely price sensitive at the moment. Like in 2021, you go into a shop, see your prices have gone up, and everyone would shrug and go, oh, isn't it terrible? And they'd buy it anyway. Now they'll turn around and they'll walk out the door. And that is partly the price of necessities, which is kind of acting like a tax in that regard. And then you've got rates, which literally is a tax as well. In that regard, I don't think those high inflation expectations are an upside risk to inflation. If anything, I think they're putting a lid on spending and actually helping put a lid on inflation at this point of the cycle. If we were in a booming economy and a booming labour market, then yes, worker demands would matter in a wage negotiation, but good luck asking for an outsized wage increase this year. It's just not going to happen. So I think, and when we ask firms in our survey, what are you going to do with your prices? What are you going to do with your what are you expecting for costs? I mean, it's flattened off, but it's not accelerating again. What are you going to do with your wages? What have you done with your wages? These things are all at levels that are consistent with inflation at target. So the good news there is that we think it does mean the Reserve Bank will chill out a bit and cut rates more. So cut this week, then we've penciled in another cut for November. But we'll see. At the moment, all that weak data in Q2 has been survey data, like our survey, but lots of other surveys as well. And there's always the possibility that what Trump's up to could impact how people answer surveys more than it actually impacts their actual business decisions. So the Reserve Bank was sort of expressing a little bit of scepticism about really whether things could really be that bad. We think they really are that bad, and that it will start to show up in the statistics like GDP. And that data sort of comes out over the next month or two. So if we get a real shocker in terms of GDP, it could be well negative, then they could well cut again in October. So bang, bang, potentially. So we're pretty comfortable with our call that the Reserve Bank is going to end up doing much more than they think at the moment and more than the market expects. But probably next week, which is their next statement, is probably a bit too soon for them to come around to our view. But we are expecting a pivot at some point. But they're very data dependent. So is us. I'm a woman. I reserve the right to change my mind. So do they. Fair enough. Yeah, they have to be responsive to the data. So a wait and see approach is understandable, but our view is the longer they delay coming around to the view that actually this economy needs a bit more help, arguably the more they will end up having to do, because then they'll be digging the economy out of another hole as opposed to just giving it a gentle push. What else? So Trump's tariffs for New Zealand should be relatively manageable, insofar as we only sell about 12% of our exports to the US anyway. And a lot of that is dairy and beef. And the prices for those are excellent. Not because world demand's booming, but because of supply constraints around the world. So if he doesn't want to buy it, somebody else will. Fine, whatever. And on the beef side of things, Brazil's getting whacked with 40-50% tariffs. So even though Australia's got a lower tariff than us, they've got only 10%, we've got 15%. This should still be a big playground for us to play in because Brazil's basically been locked out. And dairy, we've got a really diversified set of partners that we sell to. Wine is more exposed, and there the loss of competitiveness against Australia could hurt. And seafood would be another one. So definitely at the firm level, some pressures, but wine, Spy Valley, and seafood just aren't that big. In terms of the share of our economies. They're not going to move the dial in a macroeconomic sense. So that's the direct impact, but then we've still got the confidence impact, which does seem to have been meaningful, although we just don't know how much has been Trump and all the tariffs and all the noise and that freak out versus how much has been the rising price of food and the cost of living perceptions. But yeah, we'll see what happens to that data. But the other one is China, the impact on China and therefore on our commodity prices that way. Even within our global economics team, there's a range of views. Our China chief economist is quite sanguine. I think a lot of us maybe are guilty of having an outdated view of China's economy in our heads, where we think that they produce a whole lot of stuff that they can't afford to consume themselves and sell it all to the US consumers. But they've got all the latest and greatest gadgets themselves. They actually sell 88% of their domestic production is sold within China. So they're actually a much less export-dependent nation than they used to be. And also, even within that, they've become less and less dependent on the US. They're not stupid, and they saw this tension coming. They didn't know exactly when or how it would eventuate, but they have positioned themselves extremely well for this, including completely cornering the refining of rare earth minerals, which has given them massive leverage over Trump. And he overplayed his hand on the 4th of April and had to back off. So not to say it's not going to hurt the Chinese economy, for sure. And it's not just the US doing it either. Other countries are like, actually, we'd like to have a car manufacturing industry as well, so here's some massive tariffs on your EVs, whereas New Zealand's like, sure, bring them in. So we're not going to build electric cars here. So far so good, I would say. But in commodity markets, they do say the best cure for high prices is high prices, because it does bring about a supply response. And here in New Zealand, the farmers will be force-feeding their cows, basically, come on, because they're trying to, the dairy payout forecast is excellent. And of course, there will be a supply response around the world. It's not easy to turn it off and on like it is for some other goods, but when a price boom is led by the supply side being constrained, it does make me a little bit nervous that it won't maybe be that long lasting. That said, with climate change, disruptions to global food supply are continuous, and we will get clobbered with that as well. But as I said, we are one of very few countries who actually stand to benefit from that. So that very strong rural backbone means that South Island is massively outperforming the North. You can see that in our business survey. You can also see it in the Centrix data of consumer arrears, so like customers not paying their phone bill or their power bill or whatever. South Island's a sea of green and the North Island is a forest fire. But even in the North Island, it's a lot better than it was in February, which is interesting given the unemployment rate's actually still technically rising. So it must be the fact that people are rolling over onto lower mortgage rates. But to finish on a note of optimism, I'd just say that turning points in the economy happen under the hood and people don't notice them because we focus, of course, on the human cost of recessions, which is unemployment and business failures. And both of those things severely lag what's actually going on in the economy. So I think, we are expecting the economy to improve. That quite possibly started last month, but we're going to get the GDP data for the June quarter in a month's time, and it's going to be appalling. So the headlines are going to remain pretty bad for a while, but our expectation is that things are getting better, and things need to get better, or inflation's going to be too low down the track. So the jury's certainly out on how low interest rates need to go to make that happen, but I'm more confident about our GDP forecast than I am about our interest rate forecast, insofar as interest rates will be where they need to be so that the economy recovers. The risk to that is that there's some global sideswipe, but otherwise, if we don't get more cuts, it'll be because we don't need them. So hang in there. Biggest respect to all of you for running businesses. I've never run a business. I'm the only person in my family who doesn't run a business. My dad expressed some disappointment in me. But never mind. But never mind.
No, thank you, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you.